Oh, hey! Welcome back. If you are watching this immediately after watching the first video, you'll notice that I've changed and I no longer have the green screen behind me. That's simply because I recorded this a different day. So we're going to get started. We're going to jump right into our lesson. We're going to do an intro to literature, and then we're going to jump right into our first lesson, which is going to be plot. So I'll tell you when you can pause or stop the video if you are trying to break this up. But we're going to do plot, and then Button Button by Richard Matheson, and Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. Those are going to be your first kind of overall introductory readings for the lesson on plot. So we're going to begin again with an introduction to what is literature. Okay, so this is your course introduction to English 102. If you're new to the course, which most of you more than likely are, might be some new things to you. We're going to go over two main things today. An introduction to literary elements. Those are the literary elements we're going to be looking at throughout the semester. And I'm going to give you just a very brief definition of what they are, with us actually expanding on them in each one of these separate sub-lessons. And then overall, kind of a basic general definition of what is literature. So, let's get down to it. So, an introduction to literary elements. What are the literary elements? Well, there's 7 of them. So here are 4. Plot is the sequence of events that make up a story, whether it's told, written, filmed, sung. When we're talking about where we can see these literary elements, you'll see that we're going to be talking a lot about not only literature, but also film, television, even music, okay? The plot is the story, more specifically how it develops, how it unfolds, and how it moves. We're going to be looking at character also, which is quite simply a person, animal, being, creature, or thing within a story. Even if a character is simply mentioned in passing, okay? So a person is just mentioned. They don't actually show up in the story, they're just mentioned. They count as a character. Narration and point of view. Now, these are 2 different elements, but they do go hand in hand, so we are combining them into one lesson. So, narration is the way a story is told and belongs to the level of discourse. So, you have first, third. We'll go over the different varying types of narration during that specific lesson. And then point of view is what the character or narrator telling the story can see. So, it's all about perspective. And through whose eyes we are seeing the story, okay? So your point of view might not necessarily be from your main character, it could switch. But again, we'll get more into that a little bit later on. Setting, the time and place, the when and the where of the story. Theme, your theme again is your central idea, your topic, your point of the story, or essay or narrative, or whatever it is that you are distinctly talking about or reading. Symbolism, the idea that certain things represent other things. Again, this is a very basic definition of what symbolism is. And then finally, imagery, which again goes hand in hand with symbolism, so we're going to be looking at the 2 of them together. But imagery is a little bit more of a beefier definition. So imagery is the language used by poets, novelists, other writers to create images in the mind of the reader. So it creates an image in our mind. It includes figurative and metaphorical language to improve our experiences through our senses, okay? We will be reading a poem and a short story that both deal heavily with imagery, and that'll be our introduction to imagery and symbolism. So what is literature? The definitions that I'm going to be giving you, all of this information that I'm going to be giving you comes from the Norton Introduction to Literature, that should say the 13th edition. That's an error on my part that I just noticed now. So the 13th, let's make it. Okay, now it says 13th edition. See, and I leave that in there because, we all make mistakes, but I can fix it with magic. So that's edited by Kelly Mays. All right, so literature. The American Heritage Dictionary defines literature as an imaginative or creative writing, especially of recognized artistic value. There's the key phrase, okay? The artistic value. Because Who determines a work's artistic value?
Who gets to...
Is it like a panel of judges? Is it a bunch of literary critics? Is it a bunch of old stuffy English professors sitting around a table determining what has artistic value? No, let me answer. The answer quite simply is you. Okay? Recognized artistic value, it's going to have value to you. And that's one of the things that I want to stress throughout this course, is this is artistic value to you, the person digesting the information. Okay, it's not my definition of artistic value and your definition of artistic value are going to be probably very different things. And that's just how it is. That's a cultural thing. That's an experience thing. That's a perceptive thing. Okay? It's how we're raised, how we're born, how we're educated, how we're bred. The experience that we've gone through is going to change what we think is artistic. A good work of literature, regardless of its value, will make you think for yourself. Okay? And it'll make you think in what we call literary ways. Now, these are ways that cause us to come up with interpretations that yield in both insight and pleasure. Okay, you're going to be happy that you've come up with this new idea, or that you've realized this new thing about, your favorite movie or your favorite book. A literary way of reading focuses on what happens during the text, during the reading, what happens to you emotionally, mentally, metaphysically. Okay, how are you connected during that reading? What is your interpretation? Okay, this is how you interpret the reading. This is how you analyze it. Literature causes us to think, to talk, and to write, which are the three elements of this course, right? Critical thinking, discussions, essay writing. And they help us focus in and talk and think and write about those key differences and similarities among the different forms of literature. You have the short story, the novel, the poem, drama, film, television, music. They're all different forms of literature. Because literature doesn't just belong in textbooks. It's movies. It's TV.
When I was your age, television was called books.
It's, you could have a tweet.
That's my bad. I was sending a tweet.
Right? If somebody writes a tweet that to you holds artistic value, that could be considered literature. It could be a painting or a dance or a statue. These could be things that are considered literature if they cause you to think for yourself in these literary ways and analyze the world around you and get you talking. Literature is going to move beyond abstraction. It's going to move beyond just a cluster of non-tangible ideas. The goal of literature is to get us moving, talking, thinking, writing, okay? So it's to move beyond that idea of just these are just words on a page, or these are just ideas. They focus all of our senses and sensations, okay? When you're reading a book, you picture the character in your head. You can hear what their voice sounds like. If it's well written, you can often feel what they're feeling or smell what they're smelling, okay? You can feel them, all right? So all of your sensations, all your emotions, all of your senses, it's visceral, okay? It's all encompassing, and it's deep inside is where you feel good literature and you're focused. It also changes your perception. Now, that's not to say that it's going to completely make you think differently or think the opposite of the way you do, but hopefully a good piece of literature will at least help you to realize maybe that there is another argument, there is another side to the argument. So maybe not 100% change your perception, but allow you to understand that there are other perceptions of things out there. It increases your academic performance because, let's face it, you can't pass this class without doing the reading. The same can be true of any class. Okay, you can't pass medical school without opening a textbook. Okay, without knowing what you're looking for. You can't just walk into a med school and crack somebody open. All right, you have to read, you have to study, you have to take in the literature. Okay, even nonfiction can be literature. It helps us experience things vicariously through the characters, the events, the work itself. Look, I am a 30-something-year-old man living in America, I've lived in America my entire life. I am never going to know what it is like to be an 11-year-old boy living in a cupboard under the stairs of my aunt and uncle's house and be told,
"You're a wizard, Harry."
Or, another example, I am never going to know what it's like to put on a cape and cowl and fight crime, okay? Because I'm not Batman. As much as I would want to be, I am not Batman. But through these characters, through these works of literature, we can gain that experience vicariously. We can feel it, we can live it, we can put ourselves in the shoes of the main character or the narrator or the protagonist or whatever word you want to use for them, whatever they are. Or if it's like a historical novel, okay, and we're learning about events, we don't necessarily have to have lived during World War II or the storming of D-Day. We get that experience through Saving Private Ryan, okay? Why do we read literature? A few reasons. It helps us learn other cultures, okay? Again, we all come from different backgrounds, so reading works from different cultures, different time periods, is going to help us learn about those cultures or those time periods. Gives us an understanding of a different worldview. Again, it might not change your viewpoint on something, but hopefully it helps you learn that there is another viewpoint out there. Changes the point of view, as we've discussed. It helps us think outside the box. Literature is designed to get you to think about things a little bit differently than you would have before. Approach issues and problems from different angles, because that's what the characters in these works do. The characters in a lot of these stories that we're going to read don't necessarily tackle their issues and their problems with a traditional, straightforward approach. They think outside of their own box. And it helps us to also think outside of our own world. It awakens a richness and a complexity of language. There are so many people that I've talked to, so many students I have spoken to, that English is not their first language. And I'm sure that there are some of you out there taking this course that maybe English isn't your first language, but that have learned the language through reading, through watching American shows, through watching English-speaking movies, through listening to English language songs. Okay, and it awakens in us this richness and this idea. It's like this scene from Dead Poets Society.
A man is not very tired. He is exhausted. And don't use very sad use. Come on, Mr. Overstreet, you twerp.
Morose?
Exactly, morose. Now, language was developed for one endeavor, and that is... Mr. Anderson, come on, are you a man or an amoeba? Mr. Perry.
To communicate.
No, to woo women. They were going to be talking about...
Okay, it awakens in us that richness and complexity of language. What was it for? What is literature? Well, no definition is going to be 100% correct. Again, it's that artistic value, right? It's that artistic value that is going to determine if it's literature or not, and that's going to change from person to person. But as long as it gets us writing and discussing about works of literature and gives us practice in analyzing thought in depth, it can be considered literature, even if it doesn't necessarily have value to, let's say, you or I. Okay, if it is there and it's going to get us thinking and analyzing in depth, not just looking at the surface, going deep below the surface. It offers an escape. Okay, it gives us a way to escape our own world and our own lives and enter something else. Changes our perspective. Helps us see through the eyes of other people. It liberates us from the confines of our own time. Again, we didn't live through the Civil War or Reconstruction, but if I read Gone with the Wind or I watch the movie Gone with the Wind, I get kind of a sense of what it was like. Okay, I'm free from that own time. Or, on the flip side, I'm not going to live to 2121, right? But I can read a novel that takes place in 2121, 99 years from now. I can do that. It satisfies our desire for a broader experience, okay? fantastical elements, the supernatural, these magical powers, even so much, things as the perfect love story. These are things that we might not ever achieve, but we can achieve them through film, through song, through poetry, through short stories, through novels. We can achieve them through literature. Increases academic performance. Students who read tend to do better in school, not even just in English class, but in school in general. Students who read tend to do better, okay, because it fires synapses in your mind and gets you thinking about different things. So that's the end of the intro to literature. Coming up in just a few seconds, we're going to have plot. So if you want to stop here, you can stop here, come back to this a little bit later on. There is no test or anything on intro to literature on this part, but it's good information to keep in the back of your mind. Welcome back to my lesson. Now we are looking at plot, and we're going to look at Richard Matheson's Button Button, and like I said, the Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. Mostly Richard Matheson's Button Button. That's what your assignment's going to be on. So what is plot? Every story is an attempt to answer the question of what happened, right? That is, at its basic, that is what plot is. Plot prepares us for the response of what will happen, okay? So a story in and of itself is an attempt to answer the question of what happened. A plot prepares us to answer that what will happen, okay? This will take place. This will happen. What will happen? That's where the plot comes in. If you're just giving a recount of events, that's your action. That's not your plot. Action is part of the plot. Okay, so Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack tripped, he fell, he busted his head open. Jill fell down after him. They spilled the water all over the place. That's not the plot of the story. That's what happened. Okay? A good plot poses the question, why things happen. So a story in and of itself attempts to answer what happened. So what happened? That's what the story is there for. Those are the events. That's the action. A plot prepares us to answer the what will happen later on. Okay, so because this has already happened in the story, what's going to happen? A good plot, though, is going to make us sit there and go, okay, so why did Jack fall? Why did Jill trip after him? So as the Rolling Stones once said, events do not need to be recounted in order in a story, okay? We have things like flashbacks, flash forwards, exposition, and media res. And media res is a literary term. It's Latin. It means in the middle of. You could have a story that literally starts in the middle of the action, okay? It doesn't say once upon a time. No, you're just thrown right into the middle of it. That's in media res, and that is a way, and we're going to read a story later on that begins in media res. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, so keep that in the back of your head as well. In media res, all of these are different ways that an author can play with the idea of time, okay? And time is integral to plot, because we need this exposition. We need these flashbacks. Exposition usually occurs in the form of a character giving us the backstory. So in film, a lot of times it'll be a newspaper or a news report on TV, okay, or somebody recalling something that had happened earlier. A lot of times we get the exposition in a short story or a novel in a flashback. Okay, but you can also flash forward, so you can also tell your story out of order. Can there be subplots? Absolutely, there can be multiple plots in a story. Now, conflict is a major part of plot as well, and sometimes we encounter conflict in our own lives, in stories, in film. Conflict does not always have to hit the reader over the head. It's not always going to be in your face. This is what the conflict is. There could be an internal conflict. Okay, this is where a character struggles to reconcile two desires, two needs, or two duties. Okay, This is where it's not overt what the conflict is. And then external conflict would be between two people or a person and the elements or whatever. External conflict is easier to decipher and to figure out than internal conflict. We can have internal and external conflict at the same time. And we see that in the Shakespeare play Hamlet, or as I like to call it, Danish human Lion King. Because Shakespeare totally ripped off the plotline of the Lion King for Hamlet. Hamlet is internally, struggling with the idea of what's more important, my duty to family or my duty to revenge? Okay, because he has to avenge the death of his father, but it's his uncle. So he's got his duty to his family, his duty to his father. What does he ultimately decide to do? But there's also that external conflict between him and his uncle.
Be or not to be? That is the question. Well, it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die. To sleep. No more. And by sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. It is a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die. To sleep. To sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause.
Okay, so he's got that external conflict, but he also has this internal one of whether or not he does anything. Hamlet, basically, if Hamlet actually just made a decision from the beginning, that entire play wouldn't have happened. It's everything that happens in that play happens because Hamlet just refuses to make a decision. So there's that internal conflict that really kind of pushes the plot forward. This right here, this is called Freitag's Pyramid. Okay, this is the parts of a plot. You have 5 of them. You have exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the denouement. You also have it broken into 2 halves, the inciting incident, which is exposition, rising action, and then your resolution, which is falling action, and denouement. Denouement you may have heard before, because they use it a lot of times when there's like an epilogue or a scene after the credits in movies. That's a denouement. Or this, here's your ending, but then here's this extra little bit. That's also called a denouement. So exposition and rising action, this is your inciting incident, okay? Exposition, like I said, is basic background information. It reveals some source of the conflict, whether that be internal, external, both. And your plot begins there. So your plot begins with that conflict. Now, whether or not you're given the exposition at the beginning or later on, it doesn't matter, okay? Even if you start the story in media res, you are still starting your plot with whatever that conflict is. So you need the exposition to know what the conflict is. Your rising action, that's when the initial situation gets destabilized. Okay, so your rising action, okay, destabilizes your initial situation, throws everything out of whack, introduces a new conflict or intensifies an existing one. Okay, so it either introduces a completely new conflict to the mix, or it destabilizes the conflict that's already there. The climax and the falling action. The climax is also called the turning point, okay? This is the beginning of the resolution. So you're going up, you're at the top of the pyramid now. This is where kind of all the action is. This is it right here. It's the sudden revelation of the truth. This is the "No, I am your father," which is the line. It's not "Luke, I am your father." It's "No, I am your father."
No, father.
See? Told you. Okay, so it's this sudden revelation of the truth in, let's take The Lion King, okay, because it's the easiest example that most people have seen. In The Lion King, the climax is not the fight with Scar, it's not him deciding to go back, it's this revelation that Scar is the one that killed Mufasa.
Looks familiar. Where have I seen this before? Let me think. Oh, yes, I remember. This is just the way your father looked before he died. And here's my little secret. I killed Mufasa.
Spoiler alert for an almost 30-year-old movie now. It's this sudden revelation of the truth, okay? And it could be a truth that we know from the beginning that our characters don't, okay? But it's a truth that's revealed at some point. This is the moment of greatest emotional intensity. Murderer! Okay, this is where Simba gets that last burst of energy, pushes Scar to the ground, right? Forces him, tells him he needs to leave and never return. This is the climax, okay? This is where you have that revelation. Then you have your falling action. It's the release of that emotional tension. This is, again, in The Lion King, this would be when Scar has been defeated and Simba is now climbing up to Pride Rock and growls and howls or whatever, and or roars, I guess would be the proper term, and brings the rain back. And then the rain, okay, that's going to release the tension. This is where you could have a Deus Ex Machina, which we'll get into what that is a little bit later on. It's a solution, it's not a plot twist, okay? A Deus Ex Machina is something from nothing. It literally translates Latin. It literally translates to God from the machine. This would just be, something pops out of nowhere to help the characters or help the situation. And this is Patrick. Then we have our resolution, your conclusion. This is the end. Okay, it restabilizes the situation, at least for a little bit, even if it's not a permanent restabilization. Then you have your denouement, which is French for untying. There's 3 different contradictory ways that a lot of people view a denouement. They view it as the falling action, they view it as the conclusion, or they view it as the entire resolution. This is where any of those subplots would kind of get that are left would kind of get de-threaded and kind of resolved in the denouement, or it could set up for, if this is a a chapter, okay, or like a series of stories, the denouement could set up the next chapter or the next story. Like I said, we are used to this now in film. In Marvel, Marvel has been doing denouements with films after, or scenes after the credits in their films. They've been doing this for 10 years now, since Iron Man. So it's this idea that there's more to the story than, okay, there's a little bit more that we need to kind of untie and look at. That's plot. For our authors, I'm going to give you just a little bit of background about them and a little bit of publication history, and then some of the themes and things, maybe some of the symbols to look out for, and I'll tell you some little anecdotes or some important things to remember as you're reading the stories. You can look at this author section, the biography and such, before you read the story. I recommend reading the story and then coming back to this point, and watching this or doing this lesson. If this were a regular class, if this were in a classroom, that's what you would do. You read the story first, and then I'd give you the background information on the author. So this is Richard Matheson. As you can see, he passed away fairly recently, not that long ago. Here he is as a young, let me move myself. Here he is as a young man. Pretty good-looking guy. So he is an American novelist and screenwriter, primarily focused in fantasy, horror, and science fiction. He was born in Allendale, New Jersey, which, if you know the state of New Jersey, Allendale is not that far away from Newton. Okay, it's not that far away from Sussex County. He moved to Brooklyn after his parents divorced. He was relatively young. I believe he was like 6 or 7 when his parents divorced. He published his first short story at the age of 8. So here's an interesting thing about Richard Matheson is he published his first short story at the age of 8. I'm 35 and have yet to publish a short story. I've gotten stacks of rejection letters, but I've yet to actually have a short story published. And a lot, I mean, I have, okay, in like high school literary magazines, or Stephen King was published by the age of 8 in a newspaper that he started in his basement. Out of his basement, okay, he found an old printing press, and he would make copies of his stories and sell them to his friends for $25 a piece. So surely, that's what we're talking about here with Richard Matheson's first story being published at age 8, right? No, it was in the Brooklyn Eagle, which was a newspaper, like a legitimate newspaper in Brooklyn, at the age of 8. So if you ever feel bad about your life, just Richard Matheson published a short story at the age of 8. He's like the kid that wrote Aragorn. He served in the army in Europe during World War II, and this was the basis for one of his more famous novels, The Beardless Warriors, which came out in 1960. A lot of his notable works, he's written everything from novels to short stories to television shows, film scripts. He was one of the top contributors to Rod Serling's 1959 anthology series, The Twilight Zone, which is famous in and of itself, even if you don't realize that you know it. You know The Twilight Zone. You know the theme song. It's... So he wrote a lot of episodes for that, and a lot of his stories were turned into episodes of that. He wrote I Am Legend in 1954. That was filmed 4 times. That was turned into a film 4 times. The Last Man on Earth, The Omega Man, I Am Omega, and finally I Am Legend, starring Will Smith.
Keep my name out your mouth!
Sorry, Will. The Shrinking Man, which he wrote 2 years later, was filmed as The Incredible Shrinking Man, and then it was reprinted under that title after that. And then a sequel film came out, The Incredible Shrinking Woman, which was the based off of that. Stir of Echoes was a film that came out in 1999 based off of one of his novels. Hell House, again, The Legend of Hell House, was a series of films, actually. There's a few remakes of it as well. What Dreams May Come, filmed as What Dreams May Come. This is one of my favorite movies. It stars Robin Williams, and his wife and kids are killed in a car accident, and he goes to heaven to try to find them and bring them back. And is based on a Shakespeare line, What Dreams May Come. The Splendid Source, which is a short story he wrote in 1956, is the basis of a Family Guy episode. If you are a fan of Family Guy, it's the episode where they are told the dirty joke and they try to go find where it came from, which is literally the plot of that story. It's this guy hears a dirty joke and goes to try to find where it came from. Steel was adapted as a Twilight Zone episode in 1963, and then the 2011 film Real Steel, starring Hugh Jackman, where he trains the robot to box. That's the basis. That's based off of that short story as well. And Duel, again, was adapted into a film the same year it was published. Publication history. So for the publication history for these short stories, you will notice a lot of times that I will try to find the original cover art for whatever they were published in. So this one was published in the June 1970 issue of Playboy magazine. I read it for the articles. And that's the actual 1970 June issue of Playboy that the story would have been featured in. It was later published in a short story collection called Button Button, so it was later in 1970. 16 years later, The Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone has gone through 4 different iterations now. The original in the 1950s, the first relaunch in the 80s, so the episode aired of the same name in the 86. There was one late 90s, early 2000s. And then Jordan Peele just had one a few years ago that ran for 3 seasons of The Twilight Zone. And Richard Matheson's stories have appeared in all 4 iterations of the show. The 2009 film The Box, starring Cameron Diaz, James Marsden, and Frank Langella, is based on the story Button Button that you hopefully should have read. If you haven't read it, pause the video and go and read it now, because I'm going to be talking about the themes. And if you did read it, you can continue watching the video. So the themes of Button Button. Before we get into that, you'll notice I keep moving myself around. I hope that's not distracting. You'll notice here that we have this little Rick Sanchez bouncing on the button. You want to look for him. Look for him in the PowerPoints. He'll show up from time to time. It's a game that I like to play with my classes, just to make sure that you're paying attention. So the themes, we have person versus themselves. This inner conflict we talked about in terms of plot. Who in the story has this idea of them versus themselves, has this idea of this internal conflict? You could say Arthur, you could say Nora, you could argue both. Both of them are having different conflicts within their own self. Person versus fate. The question comes up, was Arthur fated? This is why I said you need to read the story before you get to here. Was Arthur fated to fall off the subway no matter what? Was Arthur going to die whether Nora pushed that button or not? That's the question. So it's, can a person overcome their fate? Did Arthur? A person versus society. That seems to be actually a big theme of this story. How does a person interact with society? How does a person not only interact with society, but how does a person form a bond, form a relationship with the society that they're in, with the society around them? That's the question. How does one fit into that society, and what is it? A symbiotic relationship between a person and their society? The Nora and Arthur argue this point back and forth with each other, and I think that that's important to remember, is that they both, okay, so one is, Nora is, well, we don't know the person, and Arthur says, well, what if it's a child? Well, what if it's a serial killer? But what if it's, the person that's going to cure cancer? What if it's somebody suffering from cancer? So there's all these different things, and how does that pertain, and how does that relate to this idea of the person versus society? Greed. Greed is at the heart of this story. Is Nora pushing the button because she's greedy, or is it curiosity, or is it a combination of the two? Why does she push the button? Some people would argue that she's greedy, okay? But think about what she says her motivations are for pushing the button, for wanting the money, okay? And look at it that way, and then come back and answer that question. Is she greedy? Do we have a moral center? If we do, what is that moral center? Is it a universal moral center? Is it universal? Are there certain morals that are universally withheld? And how well do you know somebody? That is the question that the entire third act of this story is trying to answer, right? How well do you know somebody? Because the parameters say she pushes the button, she gets the money, but someone she doesn't know dies. In this case, she pushes the button, gets the money, and her husband dies. Or her husband dies and then she gets the money. What does Arthur being the one that dies because she pushed the button, what does that say in terms of how they knew each other? Next up, we have Billy Collins. Billy Collins is still alive as of today's date. The date of I'm recording this is May 17th, 2022. Billy Collins is still alive, knock on wood, that he remains that way for a very long time. So a little background about him. He is an American poet. He was appointed Poet Laureate of the United States He was appointed Poet Laureate of the United States from 2001 to 2003. He's was a distinguished professor at Lehman College. That's City University of New York. He retired in 2016. He's recognized as a literary lion of the New York Public Library, and that happened in 1992. That's a big achievement. He was selected as the New York State Poet from 2004 to 2006. He was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He attended Archbishop Stepinac High School in White Plains, New York, received a BA in English from the College of the Holy Cross in 1963. And he's married to novelist Susanna Gain Collins. He was born in Manhattan, grew up in Queens and White Plains, and he's an only child. So this poem was published first in The Apple That Astonished Paris in 1986. So this one is even older than I am, by 1 year. This is, the theme of this poem is about experiencing life and experiencing poetry instead of simply just interpreting it. Now, it's interesting that I'm using this after I just finished telling you that, you know, we need to interpret the world around us and that you need to analyze everything. You need to analyze and work on your critical thinking. And now I'm giving you a poem that is saying to do kind of the opposite of that. But the way that Billy Collins writes it is you can do both. Okay? Because you want to experience life, you want to experience poetry instead of just interpreting what's given to you. Okay? So you can experience a poem. You can experience a song. A work of art can be an experience for you. Okay? It doesn't have to just be. It can be an experience. It doesn't have to just be something that you think about, that you sit and you figure out, well, you wouldn't just, you don't just look at the Mona Lisa and say, well, what is Da Vinci trying to show us here? No, you look at the Mona Lisa and you experience looking at the Mona Lisa. And I like this in terms of plot because it does have a simple plot line. This poem tells a story, and that's what we want in terms of plot. So that is our lesson on plot and button and an introduction to poetry. Please remember to check the prompt. There is an essay due for Button by Richard Matheson. Next time we're going to look at narration and point of view, and we're going to be studying The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, and a poem entitled Before the Internet by Philip K. So please check those out. Read that story, read that poem. Don't forget your weekly discussion board. If you have not done that yet, that is going to be part of your grade. That will count as your participation. Be good people.